My name is Elijah Ward. I'm 39 years old, born and raised in Akron, Ohio, but for the last 12 years I've called Chicago home. I built my career in commercial property strategy, mid-size firms, deal structuring, asset turnaround. Not exactly glamorous work, but quiet impact has always been my language. I'm not loud. I don't walk into a room to be noticed. Maybe because for most of my life I've been noticed for the wrong reasons. I was born with a dark birthmark that covers the right side of my face, extends from the jawline to just under my cheekbone. It's not subtle. People try to be polite, but I see the stares, the stutters, the way hands hover just slightly longer before the handshake lands. I've never hidden it, but I've also never been allowed to forget it. That morning I was early. Always am. I'd spent the night before going over my materials. Refined pitch deck, updated portfolio, client success map from the last property I helped reposition. It wasn't just a job interview. It was a partnership conversation. The kind where you walk in and don't ask to be part of something. You present why they need you in the room. I wore a dark suit, pressed shirt, no tie. Confident, not overbearing. I even rehearsed how I'd introduce myself. Steady tone, measured pace. Everything was ready, every piece. The building sat on the edge of the financial district, a glass and steel tower that tried a little too hard to look understated. I'd done my research on the firm inside. Mid-tier real estate investment company with a portfolio quietly expanding into urban redevelopment. They needed someone who understood both money and people. That's where I came in. I didn't just crunch numbers. I rebuilt space with meaning, places that lived again. I had references from CEOs, from neighborhood organizers, from tenants whose leases I'd helped stabilize. My name didn't trend, but it stuck when you saw the results. I stepped into the lobby at 8:43 a.m. Sharp, clean, the usual scent of artificial citrus and quiet tension. The front desk receptionist looked up as I approached, and for a moment, everything was routine. I introduced myself, mentioned my meeting. She glanced down at her screen, nodded and picked up the phone. I waited, arms relaxed at my sides, laptop bag balanced against my knee. Then her expression shifted. Slight, but clear. The kind of change you only notice when you've learned to notice everything. She hung up the phone and asked me to wait. Not in the seating area, just to the side. Not even a real request, more like a reflex. Something about the tone told me what was coming before it arrived. 5 minutes passed, then 7. She made another call. I heard murmurs, words like HR and confirmation. I watched her eyes flicker past me toward the elevators, then back down to her screen. Then a security guard approached. He wasn't aggressive. He didn't posture or raise his voice. He just told me there'd been a change, that the meeting was canceled, that someone would be in touch, that unfortunately, he'd been instructed not to allow me upstairs. I asked why. He hesitated, as if reading from a script he didn't write. Said something vague about internal considerations, safety protocol, HR discretion. He didn't say it outright, but he didn't have to. I've heard it before, dressed differently, sure, but always the same underneath. I asked him who gave the order. He wouldn't say. I didn't make a scene, didn't argue. I've learned that dignity stings more when delivered quietly. I turned and walked back out of the building, past the glass doors, past the valet stand, past the reflection of myself that rippled slightly in the mirror glass. Dark, suit, confident posture, and that same face I've carried my whole life. The one they'd decided didn't belong upstairs. It wasn't the first time. But it cut differently. Not because I was surprised. Because I wasn't. I walked for blocks without direction, past offices I'd consulted for, buildings I'd helped, acquire, neighborhoods I'd had a hand in restoring, and all I could think about was how fast it happened. How easy it was for someone to look at me, check a box in their mind, and delete my name from the room. There had been no meeting, no interview, no handshake, only the quiet decision made behind closed doors. The kind that leaves no trail but tells you everything you need to know. I wasn't rejected for my ideas. They never even heard them. They looked at my face and decided I wasn't their level, but I had no intention of staying at theirs either. I spent the rest of that day walking. I don't even remember where I went, just blocks and corners, traffic lights, and the cold touch of wind on my face. I wasn't angry, not the kind that explodes. I was something worse. Hollow, quiet, like someone had flicked a switch and turned the sound down on the world around me. My thoughts looped back to the moment in the lobby, to the guard's eyes, to the receptionist's mouth twitching like she wanted to explain but knew she wasn't allowed. And that phrase, still echoing in the back of my mind, not allowed, upstairs, as if I was a risk, as if I was dangerous, as if the sight of my face might shake the walls of their polished little tower. The next morning, I did what any professional would do. I followed up. Sent a brief, courteous email to the HR contact I had spoken with a week earlier, asked for clarification. No emotion, no edge, just a calm request. By midday, I received a reply. A single line. "Thank you for your interest, Elijah, but we have decided to pursue other candidates at this time." No explanation, no acknowledgement of what happened, no reference to the fact that I never even made it to the interview room. It was clinical, sanitized. The kind of message designed to close a door without leaving fingerprints, but I couldn't let it go. Not because I needed the job, I didn't. I had options, clients, retainers, ongoing work. But something inside me had shifted. A line had been crossed, not just in action, but in the quiet ease with which they did it. So I started asking around. Carefully, quietly. I reached out to a former colleague who had once worked with someone inside the firm. Nothing direct, just a conversation over lunch, a mention, a question. 3 days later, he sent me a message. No commentary, just a forwarded internal memo that had leaked from the company's HR platform. It took me a second to understand what I was looking at. Then I saw it. A flagged candidate note, my name, my photo, and beneath it, a comment. Marked as unsuitable for client-facing roles. Potential distraction due to visual profile. Recommendation, do not advance. No context, no HR policy quoted, no performance reference, just that line. Clean, cold, final, visual profile. That was the phrase. Not even an attempt to disguise what they meant. Not cultural fit. Not presentation concerns. Just visual profile. As if I was a file they couldn't open. As if the shape of my skin disqualified me from being seen as credible. As if a birthmark erased a decade of work, of outcomes, of measurable results. My chest tightened as I read the line over and over. Not because it surprised me, but because they put it in writing. Because someone had typed that without hesitation, hit save, and moved on. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the glow of the phone screen dimming and brightening in cycles. I thought about the buildings I'd helped, rescue from bankruptcy, about the teams I'd led, the deals I'd structured. I thought about the long nights rewriting proposals because I knew I'd only get one shot in rooms that didn't expect me to walk through the door. And now here I was. Excluded from an entry-level interaction because someone thought my appearance might be too much for their lobby. It wasn't rejection, it was erasure. Preemptive. Silent. Executed through a single keystroke in a system no one outside was ever meant to see. The next morning I stared at myself in the mirror longer than usual. Traced the edges of the mark on my cheek, as I'd done since I was old enough to understand mirrors. It had always been part of me. Always. Would be. I never tried to cover it, never apologized for it. But now, for the first time in a long time, I saw it through someone else's eyes. Not a child on the bus or a stranger on the train, but someone with power. Someone who could write a single sentence and collapse years of my work into an invisible, plain something settled in me that day. It wasn't rage. Rage fades. It was intent. Cold. Clear. Focused. If I was too much for their lobby, I'd make sure one day they couldn't walk through it without my name attached to the deed. Not for revenge, for correction. For the quiet violence of being dismissed by people who had no idea what I could build. I opened my laptop, pulled up every property I'd ever touched, every client I'd ever helped, and every investor I'd ever made money for. I didn't send emails, not yet, but I started to draw a new map, a different kind of strategy, not to get into their building, to buy it. For the next 2 weeks, nothing happened. No email, no apology, no unexpected message from an executive trying to salvage their brand reputation. Silence. And that silence said more than any message could. They had moved on, business as usual. I was a line deleted from their system. A face that made someone uncomfortable, processed and archived. But while they forgot me, I remembered everything. The tone of the receptionist's voice, the guard's uneasy shift in posture, the wording of that internal note visual profile. It repeated in my head like static I couldn't shut off. But beneath the noise, I kept working. I didn't call anyone out, I didn't post online. There was no angry thread, no open letter, no performance of indignation. I didn't need public validation. I needed leverage, quiet, undeniable leverage. I knew that name, the firm, the address. I started researching. Not them, but the building. The structure they operated out of. Who owned it? Who financed it? Who insured it? I traced the property management group, the original deed registration, the change of hands in 2017, the refinance deal that fell through in 2020 when interest rates began to spike. I knew what I was looking for: vulnerability. And buildings, like people, have pressure points. You just need to know where to press. During that time, I kept my head down and eyes open, continued consulting on other projects, quiet deals, minor investments, restructures for struggling owners. But I began to shift my focus, looked harder at portfolio expansion. I'd been planning to step into ownership for years, had contacts, had credit lines, had patience, but now I had something sharper. I had intent, not to prove a point, to take a position. The firm that dismissed me didn't own the building. That made it easier. Their name wasn't on the deed. They were tenants, and tenants can be repositioned. I spoke to a contact in financing, someone I'd helped through a messy acquisition during the pandemic. Asked if he knew who controlled the debt on the building. He did. Said it had been quietly packaged into a portfolio slated for restructuring, multiple properties, same region, same lender. I asked him for a meeting. It was a Monday when I walked into that office. Not the same building, a different one. A smaller conference room, no security guards, just professionals who'd seen better quarters and were trying to prevent a worse one. I didn't pitch. I presented data, opportunity, positioning, the truth that their real estate assets were underperforming and that I could turn that around. I showed them the numbers, the comps, the trends. And then, near the end, I slid a single-page summary. Across the table, my target list. At the top was the building. Their building. The one that wouldn't let me upstairs. The man across from me raised his eyebrows slightly. Asked if it was personal. I told him it was strategic. Because it was. I wasn't buying this out of bitterness. I was buying it because it was smart. Because I knew its flaws, its strengths, its blind spots. Because I had walked through its front doors once before and I knew how cheaply their gatekeepers valued potential. 3 weeks later, I got the call. The lender had agreed to terms. My investment group, assembled silently and precisely, would take controlling interest in the building. Not tomorrow, not with fireworks, but soon. The paperwork would take time. Approvals, signatures. But the motion had begun. And no one inside that lobby had any idea that the ground beneath them had started to shift. Still, they didn't call me. No one from the firm reached out. No one asked where I'd gone, why I'd disappeared. Not one of them noticed that the profile they had flagged and discarded had reemerged in their ecosystem, not as an applicant, not as a contractor, but as a stakeholder. That was fine. I didn't need them to see it yet. There's something deeply satisfying about being underestimated so completely. They had decided in a moment that I didn't belong. Not in the meeting, not in the building, not in their world. They'd erased me without ever seeing what I carried. And now, they were operating on borrowed ground. And the signature that would soon appear on their new lease extension wouldn't be theirs. It would be mine. The same man, the same suit, the same face. The one they said didn't fit. The bank was tucked into the corner of a quiet block near the river, all glass panels and brushed metal accents designed to make the place feel more like a tech startup than a financial institution. I'd been there before, years ago, back when I was still building credibility, showing up in my best suit and a pitch deck I'd worked on until 3 a.m. But this time was different. I wasn't there to ask for a chance. I was there to finalize a position. The difference wasn't in my tone or how I walked. It was in what I carried behind my words. History, momentum, leverage. The man across the desk was sharp, younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s. He had the polite focus of someone trained to say no without ever sounding rude. But this wasn't a cold pitch. He knew why I was there. The numbers had already passed through their credit models. The investors I'd brought in were solid, liquid, and strategic. The acquisition vehicle was clean, tight, structured. There were no red flags. If anything, they were trying to understand why someone like me had chosen that particular property. I could see the question behind his eyes, the calculation, the slight narrowing of his brow when he looked at the first page of the proposal. He saw the location, the occupancy rate, the debt position. It wasn't a gold mine. It was stable, underdeveloped, forgotten by bigger players chasing shinier corners of the city. But it had one thing they didn't. Context. I didn't tell him about the day I stood outside that building and was turned away before I'd even reached the elevator. I didn't explain what it meant to be flagged as unsuitable because of the shape of my face. None of that belonged in this room. It wasn't relevant to the numbers, but it mattered to me. Not out of spite, out of structure. I knew that. Acquiring that building wasn't just symbolic, it was practical. I'd studied its inefficiencies, understood its tenant churn, watched its long-term leases expire with no reinvestment in sight. It was a property in decline that didn't know it yet, and I was offering the first move in a new direction. The conversation turned to terms. We walked through contingency layers, escrow conditions, post-closing timelines. The paperwork had already been reviewed by counsel, but they still walked me through the highlights, the clauses, the covenants. I listened, took notes, nodded when needed, but my mind kept returning to the lobby of that building, to the way the air felt that day, the low hum of fluorescent lights, the receptionist's pause, the guard's voice. That was the origin point. Everything else had flowed from that. The banker leaned back near the end of the meeting and asked one final question, not about finance, not about risk, but about strategy. He wanted to know what I planned to do once the deal closed. Not just with the property, but with the tenants, the leases, the brand. I looked him in the eye and told him the truth. I intended to restructure, modernize, rethink the role of that space in the neighborhood. It was a functional asset now, but I would turn it into a cultural anchor, a place where people didn't just pass through but built from. He liked that. He nodded, made a note, and extended his hand across the table. That was it. No ceremony, no hand-holding, no need to pretend this was about anything but value, the kind of value they hadn't seen when I stood on the other side of the glass doors. That's the thing they never teach you. Sometimes the only way to be seen is to stop knocking and start buying. When you own the space, you no longer have to wait for permission to enter it. As I walked out of the bank, the city looked the same. Same skyline, same wind scraping off the lake. But I wasn't the same man who had been dismissed with a line in an HR file. I wasn't a line item anymore. I was the buyer, the name on the deed, the one holding the pen that would soon redraw every part of their structure. It started with one conversation in a bank, but what came next wouldn't be quiet. And it wouldn't be optional. It had been 5 months and 11 days since I was told I wasn't allowed upstairs. Since I stood in that polished lobby with a meeting on the calendar and a name on the visitor list, only to be dismissed without cause or explanation. I remembered the pattern of the floor tiles, the hum of the lights above, the exact angle where the morning sun caught the security desk. Some details fade with time, others sink into your memory like nails. I hadn't been back since, not even passed by. I wanted that moment of return to matter. I wanted it to be mine. The paperwork had cleared the week before. Every signature, every clause, every condition satisfied. The building wasn't in my name directly, but I was the operating partner, the one who made the decisions, the one whose approval was required before any lease was renewed, any vendor paid, any major change enacted. The building was part of a larger acquisition package, but this address was mine in a different way. I had chosen it, targeted it, walked toward it knowing exactly why. Not for revenge, for balance. I didn't bring a team. I didn't schedule a walkthrough with contractors or send an email to the property manager. I just walked in. Same door, same glass, same time of day. I wore a charcoal jacket and a pale shirt, no tie, collar open. Not because I was trying to make a statement, but because I didn't need one. The statement was my presence. The security guard wasn't the same man. That didn't surprise me. They rotate often in buildings like these, but the desk looked exactly the same. The same placard, the same muted screen glowing behind the reception terminal. I stepped forward. The guard looked up, ready to ask for ID or confirm an appointment, but then paused. Something shifted in his eyes. Not recognition, not yet, but caution, like he wasn't sure what he was looking at, only that it mattered. I gave him my name, told him I was here to meet with building management. He typed it in, slower than necessary, eyes flicking between me and the screen. Then he found it. My name, already in the system, not as a visitor, not as a tenant, but as an owner representative. His posture straightened. He offered to call someone. I told him it wasn't necessary, I was already expected. As I moved past the desk toward the elevators, I saw the receptionist, same woman. Same neutral smile. But this time, her eyes didn't skim past me. They stayed. She remembered. I could see it in the way her face didn't quite settle. Her lips parted, as if she was about to speak, then thought better of it. I didn't stop walking, but I saw her hand move just slightly to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. An old instinct, nervous, automatic. The elevator doors opened with the same low chime. I stepped in alone. The ride up was quiet. My reflection stared back at me from the polished steel panel, familiar and unchanged. The same mark on my face. The same lines beneath my eyes. The same man they once refused to let in. On the top floor, the office had barely changed. Same furniture, same artwork. The property manager was waiting. Polite, professional, flanked by his assistant. We exchanged a few words, walked through the updates, the maintenance schedule, the lease roll. Everything was in order, but that wasn't why I was here. I asked for one thing, a list of current commercial tenants and all active lease contacts. It was standard, expected, but it was also the moment everything began to shift. My name would appear on future communications. I would be copied on renewals, on expansion requests, on notices of default. And one of those tenants was the firm that once flagged me in their system as a visual risk. The irony wasn't lost on me. As we wrapped the meeting, the property manager mentioned they were planning a small event in the lobby to welcome the new ownership group. A chance for the firms in the building to meet the people guiding the future of the space. He asked if I'd like to say a few words. I told him I'd think about it. But I already knew the answer. I stepped back into the elevator, wrote it down alone. When the doors opened onto the lobby, everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. I moved slower this time, not for effect, just to feel it. The weight of the silence, the stillness, the history. As I reached the glass doors to exit, I turned back once, just for a second, to see it from the inside. The same space that once tried to erase me. The same space now tied to my signature. And that was enough. I didn't need applause. I didn't need to be recognized. I didn't need them to remember what they did, because the building remembered for them. The email sat in my drafts folder for a week. Not because I didn't know what to say, just the opposite. I knew exactly what needed to be written. I'd crafted the language carefully, stripped it down to its cleanest form, every word sharpened and balanced. But I waited, not out of hesitation, out of intention. Timing matters, especially when you're not just sending a message but drawing a line between what was and what comes next. During that week, the transition became official. The firm that had once denied me entry received its lease renewal package. Terms adjusted, rates stabilized. A memo included about new operational policies. Nothing aggressive, nothing unusual, but all of it signed by me. The first time my name entered their internal system, it had been in a flagged note marked unsuitable. Now it came stamped on formal documentation they couldn't move forward without. The signature they once dismissed had become the one they now depended on. I didn't smile when I read their acknowledgement. I didn't need to. The HR director was still employed. I'd checked. The same name that had approved the internal note about my face, the one that labeled me a client risk. He hadn't changed positions, hadn't moved to another company, hadn't been reassigned. Still there, still operating under the same patterns. I could have left it alone, let him stay, let time level it all out. But there are moments when silence feels like complicity, when accountability isn't vengeance, it's structure. So, I opened the draft again, added one line at the bottom, and hit send. The subject was simple: contract termination, notice effective immediately. It wasn't personal. It was procedural. I'd reviewed the employee file, found patterns, comments that were vague, coded, but unmistakable if you knew what to look for. Evaluations with language like inconsistent presentation or non-standard client impression. Words that echo the same message. Different isn't safe. I traced the hiring decisions, the rejections, the internal summaries. It wasn't just me. I was part of a pattern, and that pattern ended the moment my name appeared on the management ledger. The next day, I received a reply from the firm's managing director. He asked for a call, said he didn't understand what was happening, wanted clarity. I told him I'd explain everything, in person. We met in the same upstairs conference room I was once denied access to. The irony of it was irrelevant now. The room looked small, dull, like any other meeting space in any other building. But the man sitting across from me looked different. Not because he was older, because he knew. He knew what this was. He knew who I was. And he knew that nothing about this was going to be undone. I laid it out clearly. The flagged file, the hiring bias, the system they thought would never be seen by anyone outside their loop. I told him I didn't need an apology. I didn't want a meeting to restore reputation or perform damage control. This wasn't about ego. It was about alignment. About making sure that the people operating within the building understood the weight of their decisions. That no one else would be quietly dismissed because of how they looked walking through the lobby. He tried to defend the director, called him a product of the system, said he'd been valuable for years. I let him finish. Then I slid across the signed termination notice. It was done. No raised voice, no theatrics, just structure, clean and final. After the meeting, I walked through the hallways alone, looked into the offices I once imagined sitting in. The glass, walls, the whiteboards, the waiting areas with magazines no one actually reads. It all looked smaller now, not because I'd grown, but because I no longer needed it. That building had once been a place I thought I had to earn my way into. Now it was just another property in a growing list. A space I would make better, not out of spite, but because that's what I do. Before I left, I returned to the lobby one more time, stood near the glass where I had once been told to wait. I looked around. The same quiet buzz, the same filtered light. But now, when I moved, people stepped aside. They didn't know who I was. Not all of them. But the tone was different. No, longer avoidant. Just curious. That's all I ever needed. A clear line of sight. I walked out without looking back. Some victories aren't about standing in the room you were once kept from. They're about owning the space so no one else has to beg to be let in again. Outside, the sun was sharp, the sidewalk warm beneath my shoes. I slid the signed copy of the termination letter into my briefcase, closed it, and kept walking. Not because there was something left to prove, but because there was more still to build.